You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm pleased to return today with a contemporary tale of Innsmouth, penned by the great S.T. Joshi, having first appeared in the 2015 anthology Innsmouth Nightmares. I hope you enjoy this one. Some Kind of Mistake by S.T. Joshi. 1. A large section of the mighty West Antarctica ice sheet has begun falling apart, and its continued melting now appears to be unstoppable, two groups of scientists reported on Monday. New York Times, May 12, 2014. I was far from home, but an obscure necessity of a sort I could neither specify nor discount drove me on. I was in Bury St. Edmunds, on the road that leads to Innsmouth. Those who know anything of the history of New England will say that the only Innsmouth they know about is an obscure coastal town in Massachusetts, one that was the locus of some unspecified police or military action in the late 1920s, and which never subsequently recovered the prosperity that it had enjoyed in the 19th century. It was then a bustling city whose economy was based on fishing and on a gold refinery that dominated the downtown section. What, then, was I doing across the Atlantic in late summer, heading toward the east coast of England? Better informed persons will tell you that most towns in New England have their analogues, or at any rate the origin of their names, in the old country. How many know that England boasts a tiny and insignificant village named Boston? The county seat of England's Suffolk is Ipswich, whose namesake in Massachusetts lies uncomfortably near Innsmouth. And Suffolk's Dunwich, the medieval town crumbling inexorably into the North Sea, lent its name to another town in Massachusetts that many would like to forget. And so I was heading to the Suffolk Innsmouth, for reasons I could not have articulated even if the melancholy that clouded my mind had been lifted. At Bury St. Edmunds, I found the massive but nondescript Victorian railway station and took the train to Ipswich, but from there I had no option but to rent a car, in spite of my unfamiliarity and discomfort with driving on the wrong side of the road, for I was curtly informed that there was neither train nor bus service anywhere near where I wished to go. I slipped into a Ford Focus, whose steering wheel on the right side of the front seat disconcerted me. As I tentatively ventured onto the baffling British freeway system, I noted that the roads became progressively smaller and more poorly maintained. It also interested me to come upon still more analogues, exact or approximate as the case may be, for cities and towns back home. Framlingham, the presumable origin of the Boston suburb of Framingham. Boynton, perhaps the source for Boynton Beach, another obscure town that conjured up vaguely distressing memories, and so on. As I approached the coast, the road degenerated into a bizarre fusion of dust and gravel, and my fear of inadvertently driving in the wrong lane and crashing head-on into an incoming truck, or should that be lorry, gave way to an augmented terror of encountering any traffic at all on what had insidiously become a one-lane road. And then the road came abruptly to an end, or rather it intersected with another road, I use the term loosely, that ran perpendicular to it. A rusted metal sign at the intersection, with arrows pointing in opposite directions, told the whole story. Left, Innsmouth 8. Right, Dunwich 6. I saw no option but to turn to the left. To say that the road hugged the coast would be a generous overstatement. There were times when it seemed ready to plunge directly over the rocky shore and into the waiting arms of the North Sea. That metaphor may seem ungainly, but to me it carried a baleful but scarcely understood symbolism. As I pulled into the town, I was struck by both the antiquity of the few scattered homes. All seemed made of bland white stone or brick so aged that the original red had decayed to a kind of muddy rust colour, with thatch roofs so dry that a single match could set them all aflame, and the near total absence of their presumed denizens. It was mid-afternoon, and one might assume that all the residents were busy at work in offices or factories or wherever they might be employed, if, that is, any business establishments existed in the town at all. But in fact, aside from a lackluster BP petrol station operated by a stout and surly man of indeterminate age and ragged attire, a pub here and there, and a somewhat more pretentious dwelling that discreetly, almost covertly advertised itself as a bed and breakfast, I saw little commerce. I was, of course, used to this kind of ambience. I knew it well from my own residence in the New England Innsmouth. That was where I had been born, 37 years ago. I did not think it possible that all the inhabitants of this English Innsmouth worked elsewhere, returning only at evening to huddle secretively and clannishly in their dwellings. At this early stage in my quest, I was unconcerned with the comings and goings of the town's occupants as a whole. It was a single individual who was the focus of my search. I had not made any reservations ahead of time for staying in this place, but I calculated that it rarely received visitors and that some accommodation or other would be available for my use. At worst, I could stay in a neighbouring town. I accordingly made my way to the bed and breakfast, and was informed that a room was indeed available. The almost skeletonic middle-aged woman who received me, her jagged features exhibiting only the slightest trace of surprise at my unannounced entrance, was not likely to be very forthcoming with information. Nevertheless, the length and arduousness of my journey across the sea had made me impatient, and so, after I signed my name, Gerald Sanford, in the old-fashioned guest book, and she almost grudgingly handed over the key to my room, I made so bold as to ask, "Can you tell me where Maxwell Gilman lives?" All expression drained from her face, and she became even more stolidly taciturn than before, if that were possible. For only the tiniest fraction of a second her exophthalmic eyes shone with unwonted fire, as she mumbled, "There is no such person in town." I knew she was lying, and she knew that I knew it. I wondered if I had made a mistake in proclaiming the purpose of my visit so openly. But what could this woman do to me? I had paid in cash for my lodgings, and I was here for at least a week, so she'd better get used to it. There was no one to help me up the 2 flights of stairs to my room, so I trudged there myself, valise in hand. The room was surprisingly comfortable, even cheerful, and some of my accumulated unease sloughed from my mind. It was still hours before I could procure dinner, assuming there was even any place in town where such a meal could be had, and so I determined to conduct a thorough investigation of the place, at least in terms of its general topography. It proved to be quite a bit larger than I'd expected. For all the continued invisibility of its inhabitants, the relatively well-kept lawns and the absence of any extensive zones of desertion and decrepitude suggested that the residents, wherever they may have been, were not unprosperous or devoid of a middle-class sense of outward respectability. In other contexts, I might even have found this a charming seaside town, where one might retire in comfort and safety. But knowing what I did, I could not doubt that this superficial tidiness might well conceal something substantially more sinister. And, if that were the case, then Maxwell Gilman was at the heart of it. 2. What a noise we made, but it will all be forgotten. Lord Dunsany. My parents had died 4 months before my trip to England. I had hoped that I would never have to see the town of my birth. I refused to call it my hometown. after I had left it 19 years before. I knew all too well the sinister doings of the nameless shambling denizens, especially those who remained concealed behind locked doors and shuttered windows, and who emerged only at night to plunge into the waters off Devil Reef, and I considered myself lucky for having escaped the town's clutches after high school, enrolling at Bard College and convinced that I had left all trace of New England behind me. In this I was partially following the lead of my mother. Marcia Waite, of the Innsmouth Waites, had similarly found Innsmouth loathsome and somehow managed to secure a scholarship to Harvard. It was there that she met her future husband, Daniel Sanford. They married shortly after their joint graduation. But the call of her alien heritage must have drawn her back. Perhaps she felt that, with the stalwart aid of her fully human husband, she could, in some inexplicable fashion, reform Innsmouth from within. Instead, she had succumbed to the obscure genetic ailment that afflicted the town's inhabitants. It is said that, to a man in love, his beloved always looks as she did when he first kissed her. I fervently hoped that was the case with my father. Certainly, his devotion to my mother did not seem to waver as her transformation, the locals called it the turning, began to manifest itself. I was not so generous in spirit, withdrawing from my mother in revulsion as her eyes began to protrude from her head. Her skin developed a curiously scabrous cast that required constant immersion in salt water for relief. Her neck started sprouting creases and other metamorphoses offensive to sight, smell, and touch gradually overwhelmed her. She herself looked upon her turning with a kind of resigned equanimity, for she knew well what was in store for her. My father, as I say, put on a brave front and continued to exhibit the old-world gallantry and courtesy that had won my mother's heart in college. I was not entirely surprised to hear of their joint suicide when both of them were approaching 60. Perhaps it was a coward's way out. Certainly, what few friends they had, my mother had alienated most of the locals by her resolute refusal to acknowledge what they believed to be the wonders and blessings in store for them when they turned, expressed incredulity at the treasures she was so heedlessly throwing away. But my mother knew that, whatever the dubious rewards of earthly immortality in the deep might be, she would have to face it alone, or at least apart from her husband, whose full-blooded humanity assured his eventual mortality. To her, then, the boons of perpetual life under the sea were vastly outweighed by the bliss of an oblivion shared with the man with whose flesh and spirit she had fused her own. I was, as I say, not wholly surprised when I heard the news. My father had been hinting at such an eventuality for years. What dismayed me more than the fact of my parents' demise was the unavoidable necessity of trudging back from my architect's office in Ithaca to tend to their estate, meagre as it probably was. I was resolved to do so in the swiftest possible manner, putting the house up for sale and casting the legacy and memory of Innsmouth out of my life forever. But matters were not as simple as they seemed. Certainly, there was little enough to deal with in terms of assets and possessions, as I quickly learned after arranging for the quiet double funeral in the congressional churchyard. What troubled me more was the apparent derangement, it cannot be called anything less, of my father's mind, as I examined some of his private papers. In particular, a diary he had sporadically kept for years revealed what struck me as a woeful credulousness, a yielding to conspiracy theories not at all characteristic of this confirmed agnostic and skeptic. And the source of the trouble, it appeared, lay in the English Innsmouth. My mother had begun hearing from distant relatives on the other side of the water, telling of mysterious gatherings and convocations in the town hall. From what I could piece together from the diary, the letters themselves had apparently been lost or destroyed, It appeared that there were plans underfoot by the English Innsmouthians to wage some kind of all-out war upon the entire human race. When, how, and even whether this war would take place was left unclear by the diary entries. All I could grasp were faint clues and obscure implications in my father's incoherent ravings about depth charges, the shearing off of the Ross Ice Shelf, and other things too preposterous for credence. I had no illusions about the Innsmouth denizens on either side of the pond, although, in all honesty, I had not even known of the existence of the English faction until I read my father's diary. But I regarded them purely as local threats. Yes, they may have kidnapped, even killed the random traveling salesman or genealogical enthusiast, but the setback the Massachusetts clan had suffered after the federal raids of the late 1920s had, to my understanding, permanently crippled their capacity for further mischief. I had read the accounts of that raid, including the second-hand testimony of an ancient drunkard whose ramblings about the history of Innsmouth had been taken with surprising seriousness by many credulous readers. Whatever the truth or falsity of his remarks, his account made clear the deep-seated hatred and resentment of humans by the Innsmouth denizens. One remark in particular stuck in my mind: his belief that the Deep Ones could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. I smiled at this obvious instance of megalomania, the stereotypical response of a repressed minority in the face of an immensely more wealthy and powerful foe. So why had my father been so convinced that something untoward, perhaps even of cataclysmic danger to his own species, was being hatched in this obscure and sparsely populated hamlet on the shore of the North Sea? Could it simply have been that he was increasingly disheartened by my mother's transformation, leaving his own mental faculties vulnerable to outrageous conjectures that, under normal circumstances, he would have laughed to scorn? A more disturbing thought was that these whispered hints and portents had some relation to my parents' suicide. Were my parents already convinced that an apocalypse of incalculable magnitude was brewing, one that was now so unavoidable that self-extinction was the only remedy? It should not be surprising that I took my time determining my own course of action. Truth be told, I was more fearful of feeling and acting like a fool than I was in contemplating some unheard-of calamity imminently befalling the human race. Such things didn't happen in a sane world. What led me at last to act was a grudging belief that mischief of a relatively minor sort might be underway, and in that case it was my obligation to do something about it. Somehow, I felt that my own connection to the Massachusetts backwater, I was, after all, half human and half alien, might shield me against any dangers I myself might encounter. With a cynical reflection that I might at least come back with some amusing stories to tell my co-workers, I boarded a plane at Syracuse and, by a tediously roundabout manner, found myself embarking on what I was outwardly convinced was a fool's errand. The faint suspicion that something far more disturbing lay beneath my surface credulity, I sedulously strove to suppress. 3. It is good to be a cynic. It is better to be a contented cat. And it is best not to exist at all. H.P. Lovecraft. I came to believe that my clumsily direct approach in seeking out Maxwell Gilman had been a mistake, one that might alert him to my existence and my quest, and therefore place me in some sort of danger. Even now I felt that the threat he posed was either insignificant or entirely imaginary. But even if his hatred of the human race was nothing but fantasy, that would not deter him from taking violent action against someone he suspected of trying to foil his plans. One obvious course of action would be to seek out the Waite relatives here, whose correspondence with my parents had apparently been so disturbing to their mental equilibrium. Whatever knowledge they had would certainly be useful in my enterprise, and if they themselves had irresponsibly frightened my parents with ludicrous and overblown conspiracy theories, I would make it abundantly clear to them that their efforts were deeply resented. After much searching, I finally found a pub and ambled in for my evening meal. At first I sat quietly, enjoying my pint of Guinness and generous plate of shepherd's pie. The stuffy, confined quarters of the place augmented the discomfort I had felt from the heat and humidity of the season, and I repeatedly mopped my brow and the sides of my neck, as if plagued with a rash. It did not escape my attention that I was the object of keen but covert interest from the few other customers in the place, to say nothing of the surly and tight-lipped bartender, whose skull was already exhibiting some of the loathsome metamorphoses that would ultimately lead to his complete transformation. When I asked the slatternly waitress, whose rosy-cheeked complexion and capacious bosom seemed almost a more hideous anomaly in its context than the bartender's disfigurement, whether she knew where any waits in town lived, she merely stared at me blankly and said, "There are no waits here." Once again, her deceit was all too patent, but what recourse did I have? I could hardly shake the truth out of her, and I became quickly aware that my softly spoken query had nonetheless been overheard by the bartender, whose sharp glance of alarm and hostility was now undisguised. Feeling acutely uncomfortable, I got up from the scuffed table without finishing my meal and made for the exit. I could hardly expect any kind of security in the bed and breakfast that was my temporary home, but I sensed that any further investigations would unquestionably expose me to dangers whose scope it was beyond my powers to calculate. Just as I was leaving the place, another man whose presence I had scarcely noticed rose with an evilly fluid motion and followed me out, keeping so close to me that he almost stepped on my heels. With this sudden confirmation of an open threat, I became almost paralyzed with fear. I was no tough guy private eye from a 1940s film noir, and I had no weapon to ward off capture or bodily injury. In a flash, the reckless folly of my actions overwhelmed me, nearly causing me to collapse upon the hard and crumbling pavement. What could have led me to think that, as a single individual, I could somehow counteract a plot, if genuine plot it were, that had clearly been carefully planned and contemplated for months or years, with a legion of subordinates and associates assisting its creator in carrying out its complex machinations? I was therefore not surprised, and even in some inexplicable fashion resigned to feel my nameless pursuer's tight grasp of my elbow from behind. Abruptly, he shoved me into a dank alley the moment we passed the outer edge of the low-slung building housing the pub. As he pinned me to the gritty concrete wall of the building, I wearily awaited either a pummeling or the thrust of a knife into my vitals. Instead, he muttered the words, "You looking for the waits?" Speechless with terror, I could only nod spasmodically, hoping he could detect my gesture in the darkness. "All right," he growled. "Come this way." I could well be walking to my death, but at this point I hardly cared. I knew no one in this town, could summon no one to assist me, and if there was even a remote chance that this unknown denizen was sincere and not merely luring me to destruction, I felt I had to take it. I could barely distinguish the man's features in the blackness of the alley that we traversed, but something about the gleam in his bulging eyes sickened and dismayed me. I won't say that a fishy odor clung to him, for I now realized that the entire town had been bathed in that very odor, to such an extent that its absence would have seemed aberrant. The man made sure to keep us away from the few streetlights. Almost no cars, new or old, were apparent, so no headlights were likely to flash suddenly in our direction. We kept close to a succession of brick, stone, and stucco structures, ducking our heads when lighted windows appeared along otherwise blank walls, and weaving from one street to the other in such a bewildering manner that I was quickly disoriented. The extent of the town now seemed even greater than it had appeared when I first saw it, and I doubted my ability to return to the problematical safety of my bed and breakfast unassisted. When we came to a nondescript brick house that seemed a trifle more dilapidated than its neighbors, my nameless guide led me to one side of it, and then seized me gruffly, stopping me in front of what appeared to be a slanting wooden door leading to a cellar. Looking around hastily with keen suspicion, he unlocked the padlock on the door, pulled up the two flaps of the door with a swift motion, and silently urged me to enter. "Where?" I mumbled. "Quick, you stupid git, get in!" Overwhelmed with a sense of resignation, I descended into the black cavity as if stepping into my own grave. To my surprise, the place was not merely the basement of the house. Instead, as became quickly evident when my guide stalked over to a wooden door and opened it with a large and archaic-looking brass key, this underground area was the entryway to some well-constructed tunnel, whose extent was incalculable. Although the guide pulled out a slim flashlight that cast a fitful illumination along the clammy walls of the tunnel, I was now even more disoriented by the twists and turns of the tunnel than I had been when approaching this spot. In so far as my cloudy impressions could be relied upon at all, I felt that we were progressing in a southerly or southeasterly direction. At times, the propinquity of the sea seemed alarmingly evident, as I could detect the lapping of waves, even through the seemingly solid tunnel walls. As before in the pub, the closeness and clamminess of my surroundings caused an intense itchiness to throb over my face, neck, and arms. Our trudging set up disturbing echoes throughout the tunnel. That didn't seem to worry my guide, who was solely concerned with traversing this channel as quickly as he could, not caring whether I was agile or adept enough to follow his increasingly agitated course. Without warning, we came around a sharp bend, and were forced to stop. Indeed, I almost collided with my guide as he halted in front of a wall made of compacted dirt, against which a rickety wooden ladder was leaning. Pausing only for a moment, the man ascended the ladder, blandly assuming I would follow. The wooden trapdoor that lay at least 10 feet above us was apparently not locked, for the guide merely pushed it up with the back of his head and his shoulders, stepping out into the open air without troubling to offer me any assistance, as I myself emerged from the bowels of the earth. He headed jerkily toward an incredibly aged and battered pickup truck that lay in a kind of ditch or depression next to an unpaved road, climbed into it, and waited impatiently for me to do likewise. As I mechanically did so, the man pulled a key from the pocket of his trousers, started the vehicle, and deftly steered it onto the road. The sound of the sea was now plainly audible, and as soon as my eyes had adjusted to the circumambient darkness, I could see the vast expanse of the North Sea to my left, less than 100 yards from the road. I could tell at once that we were heading to Dunwich. I had neglected to do any research into that neighbour of the English Innsmouth, but somehow I had assumed that it was all but deserted. It had, of course, been a thriving port from as early as the Anglo-Saxon period, when it was the capital of the Kingdom of the East Angles, to as late as the 19th century. But the wearing away of the shore through the relentless advance of the sea had, so I believed, rendered it all but uninhabitable. To be sure, as we drove the relatively short distance from Innsmouth to Dunwich and entered the hamlet, I could see that it constituted nothing but a single dirt road, flanked by decaying stone or brick houses on either side, many of them appearing unoccupied. I could detect nothing in the way of a public building, no town hall, restaurant, petrol station, or pub, and in this near-pitch darkness it could well have been a ghost town of the sort that can still be found in the remoter reaches of the American West. My guide led me to one structure that seemed a trifle less decrepit than the others. Breaking abruptly, he merely gestured with his head in that direction, and said laconically, "In there." Why I obeyed his orders so unquestioningly I could scarcely have explained to myself. An overriding sense of doom and futility overwhelmed me, as if I had ventured into a course of action that had been fated from the beginning of time to lead to my own, and perhaps the world's, extirpation. I knocked tentatively on the thick wooden door. Almost before my knocking had ceased, the door opened infinitesimally, and a face peered up at me. I could not tell if this stunted parody on humanity was male or female, but when it uttered a single sentence I could tell it was a woman. "You the Waite that come from America?" I nodded, sensing that the inquirer would either not have known my father's name, or, more likely, have felt that my connection to my mother was the more vital relation. She opened the door only as far as was required to let me enter, then slammed it. What I saw as I entered in the cramped, dimly lit cottage was a couple so far advanced in the Innsmouth look that their human attributes were all but obliterated. The woman who had grudgingly ushered me into her home was all but bald, with only a few strands of thin, stringy, dun-coloured hair dangling from a piebald head whose facial features were scabrous and scaly, as if afflicted with some vile, scrofulous disease. The elderly man who sat stolidly in an easy chair toward the back of the room betrayed the severe distortion of the skull that I had noticed in the bartender of that seedy pub in Innsmouth, while the fingers of his hands were fusing together with the characteristic webbing that any number of older denizens in my Massachusetts hometown had exhibited as they aged. As I stood hesitantly near the front door, the woman almost barked at me, "You'd better sit down. That chair will do well enough for you." She nodded curtly at a straight chair that, uncomfortable as it was, seemed better suited for its purpose than the mangy sofa, on which she presently lowered herself. I sat down as indicated, but continued to say nothing. The woman, presumably the Mrs. Waite who held some unspecified relationship to my mother, looked at me almost as if I were a dim-witted schoolboy, and said sharply, "Well, it's about time you got here. Your parents be dead these 4 months now, ain't it?" "That's true," I managed to mumble, but I wasn't certain what to do, what was really going on here. "Yeah?" Mrs. Waite interrupted. "Well, that goes for us too. As you can see, we've been kicked out of Innsmouth, asked to leave, as the almighty Maxwell Gilman put it with that silver tongue of his. They must have known about those letters we sent to your kin. They seem to know everything round here." "So exactly what is happening, or about to happen?" "I wish to God we knew," Mr. Waite exploded out of the dark corner of the room. "They stopped letting us into their meetings once they sensed we was on the other side. But they're planning something, all right. Something big. What it is and how they plan to do it, God only knows." "But," I protested, "how could this Maxwell Gilman really do anything? My father's diary spoke of cataclysmic events that might threaten the entire planet. Gilman can't possibly have that kind of power." "Can't he?" Mrs. Waite almost shrieked in a snide voice that chilled me to the bone. "Can't he?" she repeated in a whisper. "What do you know about him? How can you possibly know what kind of power he has?" "I know nothing about him," I exploded. "No one in Innsmouth will even admit his existence." "Oh, he exists all right," Mr. Waite said sardonically. "Well, where am I to find him?" I cried. "And what am I to do? How can I, or even the 3 of us, strike back at him? Or are there more who would join us?" "A few more," Mrs. Waite said, without enthusiasm. "But most are on the side of the deep ones. After all, they'll end up down there one of these days. So would we. We could take the plunge right now if we dared. I pondered for a moment. So why aren't you on the side of the deep ones? I can point to my father as the source of my allegiance to humanity. But it doesn't seem... I broke off clumsily. No, Mrs. Waite said, in a horrible travesty of humor. We ain't so pretty anymore. Not much human blood in us. We've turned, that's a fact. Why we ain't on their side, I couldn't really tell you. Maybe it's because we always thought a live and let live policy was best. What Gilman is set to do will make everyone's life a horror, humans and deep ones alike. Maybe he don't care. Maybe he just wants to take everyone down with a ship, if you catch my meaning. I wouldn't put it past him to destroy the whole bloomin' planet just to satisfy his bloodlust. But again, I said, how can he do that? I tell you, I don't know, Mrs. Waite shouted at me. They kicked us out afore their plans were set. But I put to you, young fella, he could and he will. I was curiously unable to dismiss her words as the ravings of a lunatic or the vengeful fantasies of one who had been ostracized from the community in which she had lived her whole life. This couple had been on the scene at least at the beginning of whatever plans Gilman had had for universal destruction, and at a minimum they had to have some soupçon of evidence of his abilities. But their months-long isolation had rendered them ignorant of critical details, and all they could do was fume impotently. My subsequent discussions with the pair were inconclusive. They didn't even know where Gilman resided anymore, and in any case they expressed doubt that he could be found easily. There were all manner of secret warrens where he could lie unconcealed, even from other denizens of the unwholesome town. What further course of action any of us could take was a puzzle, but I vowed to continue my investigations, even though the couple expressed cynical doubts of any positive result. My guide through the tunnel, whose identity I never ascertained, was waiting for me in his truck, as he must have known I had no other means of returning to Innsmouth. The short drive back to the town was made in silence, and as I left him and made my way up the short flight of stairs to my room at the unwelcoming bed and breakfast, I only yearned for a long, restful night's sleep. I suppose I should not have been wholly surprised at the presence of two immense and loathsomely fish-like creatures waiting quietly for me in my room. Both flight and struggle were useless. I merely gazed at them and said, "What now?" The one who still had something in the way of lips said hoarsely, "You'd better come with us, mate." 4. Human life must be some kind of mistake. Arthur Schopenhauer. And so I was brought face to face with Maxwell Gilman. The two thugs had blindfolded me after leading me to a rickety vehicle parked on the street, and it was evident that the repeated turns they executed were meant to confuse me as to our ultimate destination. After nearly half an hour of driving, they removed my blindfold. Before us was a solitary thatch-roofed house far away from any neighboring structure, and strikingly close to the lapping sea. My captors led me into the house, opened a trapdoor toward the back of the place, and compelled me to descend a metal ladder to some underground tunnel or chamber. I wryly thought to myself that I was spending more time under Innsmouth than upon its streets, but I had little time for reflection before being led to a tiny and dimly lit chamber. Gilman was, in appearance, not at all what I was expecting. Well beyond middle age, he exhibited few, if any, signs of the Innsmouth look. If anything, he was more human-looking than myself. I had heard of rare cases where the turning took place almost overnight, with unprecedented physiological and psychological changes that unmistakably exhibited the telltale stigmata of the deep ones. But looking at this portly, well-dressed gentleman, thin blondish hair fluttering untidily above a rubicund face, seated placidly behind a bare wooden desk, I couldn't help feeling that he was the scion of unmixed English gentry. What puzzled me even more than his apparent normalcy was the cloud of gloom and melancholy that suffused his countenance, as if he were bearing the weight of a world whose dire fate he had no power to deflect. Gilman was not slow in noticing my surprise. "We meet at last, Mr. Sanford," he began smoothly. "I apologize for any roughness with which you may have been treated by my associates. It was probably unnecessary, but my colleagues are perhaps not as well-bred as I am. Class distinctions still matter in this country, I fear. You perhaps wonder that I am not more aberrant than I seem to be, at least outwardly. That is because I share an important trait with you, Mr. Sanford. I, too, am what some might call a half-breed. In short, sir, I am human in one half of my parentage. But whereas you are the spawn of a human father, it is my mother who sprang from the currently dominant species on this planet." Stunned, I could only say, "Where is she now? And what does she think of whatever it is you are doing?" "Where is she now?" Gilman repeated acidly. "She is no more. It is best not to inquire into her fate. I loved her, but was not sad to see her go. My allegiance is to the other side of my ancestry, for reasons that will become clear in due time." "Why have you brought me here?" I spat out. I was already becoming tired of exchanging words with what I regarded as the fount of present and future horror in this town. "And now that you have me, why don't you just dispense with me at once?" Gilman turned his head at a crooked angle, as if investigating a paramecium exhibiting unusual signs of intelligence. "Mr. Sanford, I will admit that the temptation to dispense with you without delay was substantial. You have been kept under close watch during your entire stay here, and we are also fully aware of the contacts between your relatives on both sides of the water. For some time, the chances of you or anyone else interfering with my plans seemed remote, but now things have changed to such a degree that—" and here he uttered a sigh of ineffable weariness. "It hardly seems to matter what happens to any of us." He went on after a pause. "Perhaps the fortuitous parallel of our mixed-race ancestry inspires me to treat you more gently than would be my wont. Perhaps I feel you deserve to know the truth about what has been happening here. A truth, I assure you, that you would have difficulty comprehending, even with what you know of the alien blood that runs through your veins." "All I know," I burst out, "is that your plans threaten all civilization, all natural law, perhaps even the fate of the solar system and the universe." "Come now," Gilman said deprecatingly. "Even my powers do not extend that far. Civilization, human civilization that is, was indeed my target. Beyond that I have nothing to do." "But why?" I cried. "You yourself are half-human. Is there nothing from that side of your ancestry that draws your allegiance?" "Don't you dare speak to me in that sanctimonious way," Gilman exploded, arising abruptly from behind the desk to confront me. His shortness of stature was no impediment to the imposing figure he cut. "I scorn my human side like the plague. If I could purge my blood, my bones, my sinews of anything relating to the human, I would do so without delay or regret. The emergence of humanity is the greatest disaster this long-suffering globe has ever endured. What have you humans done with the great gifts you have been given?" He went on in an ecstasy of misanthropic rage. "The gifts of a bountiful natural world, and the gifts of a Titan intellect that in such plangently rare instances has produced an Aristotle, a Michelangelo, a Mozart. What have you done but corrupt the planet, herd countless species to extinction, and wage cruelly destructive wars over obscure points of religious doctrine or transient political advantage? You dare to accuse me of endangering civilization?" he thundered, his wrath seeming to grow with each word he uttered. "You as a species are not civilized. You are more savage than the beasts of the forest. You are the only sentient creatures that kill for sport. It would have been a consummation devoutly to be wished to have extirpated the human cancer from the planet." The one thing my reeling mind seized upon in this insane rant was a pair of inscrutable words toward the end. "Would have?" I said faintly. "Oh, yes," Gilman went on with scarcely an interruption. "I had great plans, and I could have carried them out to the letter. Look here." He boldly approached me, seized the lapels of my coat, and almost spat his next words in my face. "What do you really know of the Deep Ones? Do you think that the small colony that flounders under the waters near your hometown in far-off Massachusetts is of the slightest consequence? Does it not occur to you that there are dozens of such colonies under the sea in every corner of the world? If you were ever to think of the extent of all that may be brooding down under the deep, you would doubtless wish to kill yourself forthwith. And it was my plan to harness those legions of Deep Ones to extinguish your puny race, as if it were an ant-hill brushed away by the heedless foot of a passer-by. It was all so carefully worked out. The details won't interest you. They no longer interest me. But let me just hint that they involved such things as the manipulation of thermal vents to raise the temperature of the seas, the harnessing of the Shoggoths. You do know of them, don't you? To shear off the entire Ross Ice Shelf to raise the ocean levels. The Earth is 3/4 water by surface mass in any event. It would not have taken a great deal of effort to cover over that insignificant remaining quarter, so that your land species would have been entirely obliterated. You're not referring to global warming, I said incredulously. You had a hand in that? How I wish! Gilman cried out in a kind of mirthless laugh. How fervently I wish! But I cannot take credit for that honor. Let me show you what really happened. With that, he made an almost imperceptible motion with his head, and at his apparent command his two thugs seized me unceremoniously and dragged me in the direction in which Gilman himself was headed. A door that I had almost failed to notice led to a lightless corridor whose odor of salt water was unmistakable the moment I stepped or was forced into it. A distant shimmering of light and the sound of lapping waves made it all too clear that we would shortly emerge to face the wide expanse of ocean. The terror and unease that had been accumulating in me from the moment of my capture were now increased 1,000-fold as I was led unwillingly to that aperture. Absurd and ludicrous as my personal fate now seemed in light of the danger that I still believed Maxwell Gilman to constitute to the entire planet, I nonetheless shrieked out, "No, no! I can't swim!" The irony of my inability in light of my heritage did not escape me. As we came out into a short platform that led directly into the sea, Gilman turned to me contemptuously, and, giving a brief glance at either side of my neck, said, "Oh, yes, you can." With that, he stripped off his clothing and plunged into the water. My captors relieved me of my clothes and threw me into it an instant later. I was prepared for death, prepared either to die from drowning or from hypothermia. Warm as this late August day had been, the chilliness of the water with the advent of night could scarcely be doubted. And yet, as I inexorably followed Gilman's downward course through the waves as if tied to him by some invisible but unbreakable tether, I experienced an amalgam of unprecedented sensations. The seamless and anomalously pleasurable flowing of water through my nose and mouth, the extraction of oxygen therefrom, and the expelling of the water through what I was compelled to acknowledge were my gills. The perception of warmth and envelopment that the water lent to me, a perception that I had never experienced on even the sunniest days in the open air. And, most harrowing of all, an unmistakable sense of fitness as I swam down, eternally down to the depths, with Gilman constituting an imperious beacon that compelled me to follow. I belonged here in the sea, as I had never belonged on land. I could imagine the wonders and glories to which Gilman would lead me. An underwater city analogous to Yarnith Lay, the sunken city off Devil Reef, whose temples, colonnades, and alien carven statuary had, as I now suddenly recalled, filled my dreams from infancy. Was I now, in spite of my initially hostile intent, to be accepted as a true and respected member of the submerged realm on this side of the Atlantic? Would my mere intent to cause harm to the deep ones be forgiven as readily as the actual harm caused by that hapless half-breed Olmsted had been forgiven so many decades ago? I began to sense a gradual lessening of the impenetrable blackness of the water ahead of me, and felt we were approaching our destination, whatever that may be and whatever role I would play in it. But the sight that actually met my eyes was beyond prediction, and beyond comprehension. With uncanny elegance, Gilman abruptly halted in the midst of a plunge, and with a sardonic wave of his arm, urged me to take in the scene that suddenly burst upon my vision. I brought myself up next to him, and frantically sought to understand what I saw. To be sure, a city of nearly incalculable extent lay spread out before me, on the ocean floor. Whether the dominant material that had gone into the construction of the homes, temples, and other structures was of marble or limestone, or some substance unknown to the surface world, I was unable to conjecture. It was difficult enough for me to absorb the exquisite but utterly alien carvings, bas-reliefs, and filigreed ornaments that covered almost every inch of each building, the cumulative work of uncounted centuries and uncounted millions of hands. The very streets, wide and lavish, as in any metropolis of earth, were painstakingly decorated with mosaics of exquisite intricacy, while the pillars and colonnades of the more substantial edifices evoked a Titan majesty that dwarfed even the noblest analogues of Greece and Babylon. And although I had never been to Yarnith Lay, but had only heard dimly whispered accounts of it from my family, this immense and complex habitation in all likelihood stood in relation to its Massachusetts counterpart as Angkor Wat stands in relation to a hastily built sandcastle on a beach. What I did not see were any occupants. As if sensing my puzzlement on this score, Gilman suddenly shot forward and made his way along one of the main avenues bisecting the megalopolis. I unthinkingly obeyed his unspoken command to follow, and as we approached an imposing structure that I took to be a house of worship, I felt I had no recourse but to drift after him as he made his way inside. I did not attempt to count the number of bodies that lay piled in disarray in every corner of the building. These deep ones had all but lost whatever superficial human attributes had been theirs when they dwelt on the surface, but the loathsome grey-green hue of their skin bespoke a corruption so vile and at the same time so pitiable that my emotions whirled, reeling from disgust to terror to bafflement to heart-rending sorrow. The popping eyes, the round pustules that covered the creatures from head to foot, the gaping wounds that revealed a skeletonic structure that seemed strangely melted or fused, all these things I absorbed in a single glance. My horror of individual decay was overwhelmed by the appalled perception of cumulative annihilation. It was the same from one structure to the next, as Gilman scornfully led me through what had become an inconceivably vast mortuary of the deep ones. My brain was numbed at the sheer scale of the cataclysm. It was as if we had, by some dreadful mischance, ventured on a battlefield where not merely thousands, but millions had met their deaths in every possible manner. Not a single living specimen was visible to us, although there were, in grim irony, some strangely glowing deep-sea organisms who had somehow survived the destruction, heedlessly floating around and through some of the deep ones, as if no longer fearing their erstwhile foes and rivals. But perhaps the worst sight was something I glimpsed as, sickened, I silently begged Gilman to return me to the surface and away from this Everest of death. As he cynically agreed to my request, we turned and began our ascent. But as we passed an edifice that seemed to have been under construction but left unfinished, I saw to my horror some amorphous mass whose exact outlines I could not entirely descry. The object appeared to be flat, approximately round and mostly black, although with irregular patches of grey or brown. There were also a nearly incalculable number of the pustules, some of them oozing an unhealthy green ichor, of the sort I had seen on the dead deep ones. I knew then that I had at last seen a Shoggoth, but it was a Shoggoth whose impressive prowess as a beast of burden was permanently ended. 5. "Can't you even now guess the truth?" Gilman taunted me. We had returned to the claustrophobic room into which I had been thrust when I had first been brought to meet my perceived nemesis. For all the sense of comfort I had initially felt when plunging into the waves, I was relieved to have returned to the surface and into the normal attire belonging to the human side of my ancestry. I shook my head dismally, scarcely able to utter a sound. "Your education seems decidedly deficient," Gilman went on in mockery. "There is something ironically fitting in what happened down there, especially fitting for us half-breeds, you and I. For all my disdain of humanity, I am forced to acknowledge that I remain half-human. How I wish I could tear my body to shreds and hurl that half to perdition. I had such great plans," he continued in a curiously soft, almost pleading voice. "Such plans for the extirpation of the surface denizens of this long-suffering globe. But you beat me to it. It is you, your species, for you obviously ally yourself to your human half, that caused that decimation below. It was your collective actions that you now mask under the bland euphemism of global warming, that will be the ultimate exterminator of both of our species. The cumulative effect of the last half-century is to have raised the temperature of the oceans by only a few degrees, and also to have increased their acidity. But that was enough. For creatures of such delicate constitution as the deep ones, yes, delicate, for the fact that we are hybrids means that every one of our physiological reactions is balanced between extremely narrow poles. The slightest change in our environment is fatal. If these changes had occurred gradually, we might have been able to adapt. But the rapidity of the transformation, especially in recent decades, was beyond our capacity to absorb. This was why I, who had previously regarded humans as a minor nuisance whose destruction we could not bother to undertake, felt the need to take action at once. But I was too late. The reports of underwater deaths had first come as a trickle, then in greater and greater numbers, and you know all too well what the final outcome has been. Yarneth Lay has, I dare say, perished as well, to say nothing of the dozens of other colonies that we established in all corners of the earth, or, rather, under it. My only consolation is that humans have condemned themselves at the same time that they heedlessly and unwittingly brought death to the deep ones. For the effects of global warming, as your own scientists admit, are irreversible. Your planet is doomed, The human species is doomed." In a trembling voice that paradoxically mingled intense satisfaction and a kind of objective pity, Gilman went on, "The human species was never meant to rule this earth. It was all some kind of mistake. And now, through its own greed and folly, it is hurtling down an ineluctable path toward rectifying that error. My only regret is that I shall not be around to witness the culmination of this ridiculous tragedy." With a wave of the hand, Gilman dismissed me, as if I encapsulated the minor nuisance that the entire human species had once represented to him. "You'd best run along home. You have no place or function here. There is no need to worry that I am a menace to your civilization. I can do nothing now. I will remain on the surface as long as my body can endure it. Then I will plunge beneath the waves and join my brothers and sisters in a death that I now welcome. If I were you, I would seriously consider doing the same." As I trudged away from Innsmouth and sought to return to my now empty and futile life across the water, I began to suspect that I would do exactly that. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,